Good afternoon, everybody. And my name's Smita Jamdar, and I'm partner and head of education at Shakespeare Martineau Solicitors. And we're here today to mark the publication of a very important new report called Going Further and Higher, which explores the relationship between colleges and universities. And it comes from the Independent Commission on the College of the Future, of which I'm an expert panel member, and Sheffield Hallam University on behalf of the Civic University Network, which was born out of the Civic University Commission, on which I sat as a commissioner. So I feel very, very connected to this report and incredibly pleased that we've got to the point where it's been published. The report's available on all of the websites of the organisations I've referred to, and it sets out very pragmatic suggestions on policy and practice that aim to overcome the systemic challenges that we've seen to college and university collaboration across the UK systems. And this builds on the overarching work of the Commission over the past couple of years. I'm really pleased to be joined on the panel by a number of people who are leading conversations in this area and who already engage with colleges and universities, who are going to share some thoughts with you. A little bit of housekeeping before we start the session. The session is being recorded and it'll be made available after the event. Please do use the Q&A function to ask your questions to the panel, and I'll make sure that I put them to them after the opening comments. You can also use the chat function if you want to have some event commentary and also for connecting with others who've joined us today. So before inviting our panelists to share their thoughts on how to build a more collaborative system, I wanted to just reflect on why I think collaboration is so important. We all know that colleges and universities can be key anchor institutions in their places. Legally, all traditional universities and colleges are charities and set up for the explicit purpose of advancing education and knowledge for the public benefit. Now, I like to think of advancement in this context as not just pushing at the boundaries of human knowledge, which I think is how we traditionally understand it, but also pushing through barriers that exist to people benefiting from education so that you can do so whoever and wherever you are. So in my view, universities and colleges share a unifying ambition to support the skills and education systems and make sure they're fit for the future and offer opportunities for everyone to learn at all levels throughout their lives in all communities. So from a purely legal perspective, we can almost ask the simplistic question of why more collaboration isn't already happening, since it's part of the DNA of institutions. But we know that relationships between universities and colleges aren't just about the legal. They're shaped by cultural, economic, and structural levers and barriers. And the balance between collaboration and competition at the crux of most tertiary systems isn't quite right in my view. And too often collaboration happens despite the system and not because of it. One of the real strengths of the Independent Commission on the College of the Future's work was the ability to draw lessons from comparing and contrasting experiences and systems across 4 nations to draw out the principles for a college system of the future. And from that work, there are some very clear implications for college and university relationships. Interestingly, right now, across the 4 nations, the future of tertiary education is a very live conversation. So we've had the Scottish Government recently responding to a Scottish Funding Council review into coherence across the system. We've got legislation on post-compulsory education in Wales, which is currently going through the Senate. And in England, a place where perhaps there's more competition than collaboration, we've had the Skills for Jobs reform agenda, and we're waiting still for the government response to the Augar review. Last week, we had the publication of the Levelling Up White Paper, a UK-wide strategy, although it had more tangible implications for English education and skills. And it called for systems reform in order to redress regional inequalities with focus on pay, employment, productivity, and left behind places. And this has very obvious echoes of this report's focus on people, productivity, places, and partnerships. So with so much happening right now, it's brilliant to have a very wide variety of voices speaking today from across policy and practice and from across the 4 nations. So speaking first, it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you Sir Ian Diamond, who was chair of the Independent Commission on the College of the Future. Ian.
Cesar, thank you very much. It's an enormous privilege just to say a few words at the beginning of this launch. I mean, I absolutely love the title because going further and higher is surely what we should be absolutely passionate about, ensuring that every person, every learner who has the opportunity to even think about attending any of our institutions is inspired to do. Recognizing that for some people, they won't exactly know what the full journey is that they are going on when they commence it. And secondly, for some people, they will be constrained by other lifestyle factors in their lives as to where they can study. And so I think it's incredibly important we recognize that going further and higher should be our mission. But at the same time, we then need to work out how to do that. And it's been an enormous privilege for me to chair the Independent Commission on the Future of the College, because one of the real motivating factors for that has been to take a four nations approach. And Smitty, you just beautifully outlined some of the developments that are going on across our four nations, all of which have enormous impacts and from which we can all learn. The natural experiment that is our four nations is something that we should treat absolutely carefully and do so in learning in every way from it. And so I'm terribly excited by the maintenance of that four nations approach. The other thing I wanted to say was to really welcome the partnership with the Civic Universities Network. I will note that John Goddard is on the call. I think we all owe him an enormous amount of debt for his continued driving forward of that whole idea of a civic university. As we aim to level up our entire nation, I think it's incredibly important to recognize the roles that institutions in their areas have. We also know, as I said previously, there are those people for whom their opportunity to go to any institution is constrained by their lifestyle, and therefore they may only be able to go to one institution. But surely that must not detract in any way from the opportunities that they have. And that's why one of the reasons that I have pushed for many years that there should be very strong links between universities and colleges. And it has been an enormous pleasure for me to see the strengthening of those links. And I think they're only going to go in one direction over the next few years. I gave a talk recently at the University of Surrey, and I was privileged there to know that in Farnborough, which is not a million miles away from Guildford, they have many students studying University of Surrey degrees and being able to move freely and freely and easily between them. So the partnership between further and higher education seems to me to be critical. And I know that, for example, in Wales, it is absolutely embedded in much of what goes on, but we need to learn, I think, across all four nations on how we can continue to embed. Because the one thing I do know, if I look at the data, and you'd expect me, Smitter, if I may, to say a couple of words about the data. What the data are showing is that we have a country which has great skills, but with an ever increasing demand for a wider range of skills over the next few decades, an ever increasing demand for a wider range of skills, particularly as in some areas, those people now in employment will tend to move into retirement at different speeds. So the opportunities that exist to develop those skills in partnerships between colleges and universities seems to me to be important. And developing skills not only ab initio, but skills of people deciding to, if you like, change their skills and go into different directions. And I think that is something we also need to encourage and to enable and to do everything we can. And I think the partnership, not only between civic universities and colleges of further education, but with employers, is one that I hold in very high stead. The partnerships that my institution, the Office for National Statistics, has with local providers of both further and higher education is one that we value enormously and, again, wish to embed as we build skills and encourage people to upskill as they move forward. So, look, Smitha, I'm going to pass back to you now, but I do so commending this great report, going further and higher. That's what we must all be thinking about doing today. That's my motto of this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sirian. That was fantastic to set the scene and also to outline the extent of the challenge, but also the opportunity that lies ahead if we get this right. I'm now going to ask Richard Calvert and Philippa Olway. Richard Calvert is the Deputy Vice Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam University and the Strategic Lead for the Civic University Commission. And Philippa is co-author of the report for the Independent Commission of the College of the Future, to present some of the report's recommendations and findings. So Richard and Philippa, please.
Smita, thank you. Thanks to you and thanks to Ian as well. I think you've set the scene incredibly well, and lots of you on this call, I'm sure, will have had a chance to have a look at the report. If you haven't, then I very much hope you will. And we're going to pull out a few of the key messages from the report. One of the things we've tried to do with this report, and I hope one of the things that makes it a really rich report, is the combination both of trying to capture some of the big lessons and big picture themes that are going on across the four nations of the UK, but also to really look in detail at some of the great examples that are happening at a local level. And I think that interplay between what's working in practice, but also what are some of the wider ambitions is what we've tried to steer through. So as you say, Philippa and I are going to do this between us. I'm going to start with a little bit of the picture and the sector leader recommendations. I'll hand over to Philippa, and then I'll just share a few very quick reflections at the end from the perspective of someone who's a leader in the HE system at the moment. So let's just start with the landscape and what were some of the lessons that we found from looking across the four nations. I think the first thing to say is that while there are some very clear differences across each of the countries, there's also some very common themes and some very common challenges as well. So first of all, there is absolutely a shared ambition for a more cohesive approach across tertiary education. And we see that playing out in slightly different ways in different parts of the UK. But that recognition, which you've alluded to in the introduction, that recognition of the importance of a more cohesive approach is recognised right across the UK. At the same time, looked at from a local level, despite, if you like, that ambition being accepted and recognised, things often feel pretty difficult. And I think we have to be honest, and everyone we've talked to has been really honest about the fact that relationships between colleges and universities at a local level often feel pretty challenging. Sometimes there are some very specific local factors that impact that, but also there are aspects of national systems which can impede, if you like, a more cohesive approach. And Philippa particularly will say some of the things around what might get in the way from a policy perspective. At the same time, picking up the examples that we've tried to capture in the report, there are some notably strong examples, both at a local level and certainly in terms of the evolution of national policy. So it's a mixed landscape, it's a complex one. There's a shared ambition, there's some common problems, but there's also a lot to build on. And what we've tried to do in the report is really learn from both the policy and the practical examples and build out of that some recommendations for how we can move forward at much greater pace and with greater ambition. So if we go on then to looking at how have we tried to frame this in terms of the report as a whole. And at the heart of this is what we see as very much a shared mission. It goes back to some of the underlying purposes of both universities and colleges and the fact that so much of that is shared. So we see a shared mission across the whole tertiary system, which we've built around people, around productivity, around places, and around partnerships. So fundamentally, and Ian's alluded to a lot of this in his comments, this is about putting people and putting learners at the front of our minds and building a system which offers routes and pathways and connections that work for people. Secondly, it's about recognizing how critical we are to our local economies, to our local skills systems, and how important that is in the context of the challenges around levelling up and many other things. So putting productivity and recognizing the importance of a more cohesive approach to the overall strength and prosperity of our local regions. Building on that, this is fundamentally about place. I think it's not a coincidence that from an HE perspective, it's the Civic University Network, which has been the forum for really pulling together some of our thinking around this. And similarly, that was a key theme in the work of the Commission on the College of the Future. So places are central to this. And we know that skills and education are central to not only having prosperous places, but sustainable and healthy and fair places. And finally, none of this will happen without productive partnerships. We'll come back to some of the challenges around partnerships, but here's the vision around people, around productivity, around places, and around partnerships. So we're going to go on now in the next couple of slides to how do we then turn that into some practical recommendations. I'll do the slide on recommendations for sector leaders, and then I'll hand over to Philippa to look at recommendations for policymakers. So going with this theme around learning from what works in practice, as well as looking at some of the ambitions, this report looks to combine some really practical recommendations with some bigger picture recommendations. There's something really important for sector leaders that's really practical around agreeing the geography that we want to focus on at a local level. So you'll see in the report, and particularly in the examples, there are cases where successful relationships have been essentially built between a single HE institution and a single FE college. And there's examples of that at a local level. Equally, there's examples where it's about a much bigger geography and perhaps a more complicated group of institutions. I think the lesson we take from the report and from looking across the UK is don't worry about there necessarily being one right answer. There is inconsistency across the UK. There will be. That is not necessarily a problem, but work with a geography that feels like it makes sense at a local level. The second thing, and this goes to the heart of delivering that shared mission that we've just talked through, at the heart of this is developing a cohesive education and skills offer. It's not necessary to have that as the only mark of success at the start of this. So, you'll see through the examples, a lot of what is successful in this space is about building up small steps to bigger steps, building confidence. But with this ambition of a more cohesive education and skills offer, it might be built, as you'll see from some of the examples, around a very specific theme or specific sector. It might be built in slightly different ways. So the ambition is for cohesive offer, but I think what we see in all the examples that we've looked at is take time to get there and build it up step by step. And then the third recommendation for sector leaders, and I think this is a really critical one if any of this is to be sustainable, is that this has to be about more than a small number of personal relationships. We've seen plenty of examples where progress has been made because a couple of senior leaders will get together, they'll work more closely, one of them moves on, another one moves on, and then we're back to square one. There's some really practical examples in the report about ways in which relationships can be built into a more holistic and a more sustainable basis, some of them around governance, some of them around embedding in institutions, organizations. But what we see with all the relationships which have really built sustainability is they have to be about more than a small number of individuals. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Philippa at that point, and we're going to go on to recommendations for policy leaders.
Thank you, Richard. So yes, as we've said, this definitely isn't a report just for leaders. There's definitely a role to be played for policymakers too, to kind of make that collaboration at a local level far more easier. The systems, as has been said already, but it's worth reiterating, in each of the four nations are of course unique. They have unique histories, unique politics, unique cultures, and there's a lot to be gained from learning from each other, which we have been doing throughout the Commission's work. On the one hand, from learning lessons, we can see how collaboration can be incentivised through funding, through expectations of working together, to support the capacity needed to drive this. But on the other, it can also be hindered by disjointed initiatives, inequity in funding, and disparate approaches to accountability. And this can often result in low levels of trust, which is a real barrier, as is lack of sufficient headspace for leadership and others to be doing this. But what is clear is the mission that we're all speaking to in terms of delivering for people, productivity, and place. Before I get into the details of the recommendations, it is worth saying that these recommendations that we set out are already being addressed to varying degrees and extents in each of the four nations. So where this is the case, our report, we hope, is an affirmation of approaches, on occasion a challenge to go further, and also an encouragement for others to follow. So to the recommendations, of which we have 5. The first is to set out an ambition for a 10-year strategy. We think this would enable to strengthen the mission, so everyone's singing off the same hymn sheet, and to ensure that stability, long-term stability is there, as well as that coherence. Secondly, and this is one that we hear time and time again, especially in an English context, is ensuring the balance of investment in FE and HE systems. So of course, colleges do FE and HE, universities do FE and HE, but the balance is obviously different in the two sectors. So to ensure that the whole of the system is sustainably funded, we think will mean that institutions can go to partnerships from a position of strength rather than competition. Thirdly is ensuring that everyone can access the lifelong learning that they need to support their life development, their career development. And we see inequity in maintenance support across FE and HE for students and prospective students. So we think regardless of age, regardless of personal circumstance, or their route or pathway into education, we think having maintenance support for all that is balanced is really important. Fourthly is defining the distinct but complementary roles for colleges and universities. This varies across the four nations. Some have more of a messy middle in terms of the levels of education. So really it's important to avoid that turf war. And we hope that the local level recommendations that we make here too really provide a blueprint for doing that too. And finally is the single funding and regulatory body recommendation. So we see this to the direction of travel here in Wales, which Jana will speak to later, but we think that this will kind of simplify the system, drive efficiency, and ultimately have better strategic coordination and trust. So as I said, we've learned lots of lessons from across the four nations. So we set out spotlights in the report for each of the four nations' sort of policy features. I won't go into too much detail here because it's set out quite extensively in the report, but I just wanted to touch on these 4. So in Scotland, we see articulation agreements, which enable students to gain access to university education, and that doesn't double up moving from college to university. So this avoids repetition, and we see local leaders taking responsibility for developing joined up pathways. And at best, this makes sure that it's sort of strategic coordination too. In Wales, which as I said, Jana will speak to, there's a new commission that's going through legislative stages at the moment. It's a key part of their reform agenda, aimed at building an integrated, coherent system where vocational and academic learning are equally valued. And we think this shows real ambition in terms of simplifying the system in Wales. In Northern Ireland, we have curriculum hubs. So each of the 6 regional colleges in Northern Ireland lead on a specialism. And there's lots to be learned here in terms of building connections between colleges and HE in a really specialised way. And similarly, in England, we've got IoTs. So they're employer-focused providers specialising, and it's a really tangible area where innovation is kind of the focus, and the role of colleges in innovation can sometimes be underdeveloped. But these really showcase that and show that innovation in investment and enabling specialisation can help, and they're thinking about new ways of joint governance there too. So before we hear everyone's perspectives and responses on our brilliant panel we have here today, I just wanted to touch on our next steps. So yeah, please do continue getting involved in the conversation and share your partnerships. We're continuing to take case studies, and we'll be showing them on our websites and holding future roundtables to take this forward in each of the unique contexts of the 4 nations. And that will be me, Smita. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philippa. Richard, were you going to say anything else at this stage, or?
Yeah, I was just, because we're going to go on and hear some perspectives from other sectors. I'm just very quickly going to say 2 or 3 things. I'll be quick because we've covered a lot of this, but just a couple of perspectives from an HE point of view as someone who's been involved in the report, but also in trying to build partnerships locally. I think the first thing is we all have to be quite honest about ourselves, and if we're trying to build more successful relationships, I think as universities we need to recognise we are not always easy to work with. We're not always good at joining up within institutions. We're not always good at joining up with other institutions, be they HE or FE institutions. So there is something about recognising that successful partnership isn't always on the terms that we would necessarily want to start with. So there's something about being honest about that, about being willing to listen and learn. And critically, I think this is something which I certainly observed within the HE sector, the need to be able to step back from very specific interests and take a whole institutional approach. This is fundamentally about the institution rather than necessarily just around individual bits of it. So we have to be honest about that, and we have to challenge ourselves to be, I suppose, if you like, good partners. The second thing, and my second reflection, it goes to the heart of the report, is as universities, the vast majority of us are committed to being civic institutions. That may not be the same for every university, it may not be the same in every part of the UK. But if this agenda is not part of being a civic institution, then I think it's really hard to see what that civic role is all about. So fundamentally, if we're serious about being civic, then this agenda has to be part of that. And then my third reflection, and it comes back to, I suppose, the universities and how do they work. There is also something here about agility and about resourcing. This isn't an agenda that is fundamentally about putting millions of pounds into new initiatives. It might be, but it doesn't have to be. This is about working hard with partners, getting to know each other, building on small foundations, building something bigger. But we have to be more agile about putting effort into that. And we have to recognise, comes back to the point about sustainability in the whole institution. This has to be about more than something we do on the side of our day job. We have to, as institutions, be prepared to put some time and some leadership and some effort into making it work. I think if we do that, then we see from the examples in the report some real benefits, both institutionally and, more important, for place and for the wider civic mission. But it does take some effort, and we have to be prepared to put some time and effort behind it.
Thanks very much, Richard. It's always easier said than done to find that time, but I think you're absolutely right about the importance of doing so. I'm now going to invite Audrey Cumberford to address the audience. Audrey is the principal and CEO at Edinburgh College and was a member of the Independent Commission on the College of the Future. And Audrey, you're going to share your perspectives as a college leader.
Smita, thanks, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us. Well, if I can just start by giving a brief reflection on the progress that's been made in Scotland. And if I was to sum up, I would basically say that the voices are there, There is very much a consistency in the ask, and the foundations have been set. So it feels like we're at quite a critical point in Scotland in terms of that, levelling up and enhancing what we do. So to give you an example of some of the things that have happened in Scotland, particularly over recent years, the Scottish Government established a Strategic Enterprise and Skills Board. Now, the purpose of that board originally was to maximise the impact of the collective investment across our skills and tertiary education systems. So that included things like Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Enterprise, supporting businesses, etc. That board's been in place now for a few years and is currently going through a review of the role of that board. I was personally involved in the Cumberford Little report, which was a report commissioned by Scottish Government ministers specifically to look at the potential and the untapped potential of the college sector in relation to contributing towards economic growth. And it's interesting, Richard, just listening to some of your comments there, is that the last words that were written in that report were actually the title. And the title was One Tertiary System, Agile, Collaborative and Inclusive. So it's really interesting to see a lot of that played back in the report that we're launching today. And of course, then there were the Commission reports on the College of the Future and a Scottish version of that report. And then, Smita, as you mentioned in your introduction, the Scottish Government tasked the Scottish Funding Council to basically do a review of sustainability and coherence across the tertiary education and research system. And what came out of that review was a significant number of recommendations. And I would probably sum it up as a lot of implied ambition and boldness. And then the Scottish Government in October just last year actually published their own response to that report, where they accepted actually almost all of the recommendations. And one of which is a kind of hot topic in Scotland at the moment, is that the Scottish Government agreed to develop a strategic intent for the tertiary education and research landscape in Scotland. Now, what strikes me is clear and possibly reassuring actually, is the level of consistency that is emerging through a lot of this work and thinking and conversation. And if I was to identify 3 areas of consistency across all of what I've just described there, it would be 1, the importance of that collective strategic intent. Philippa, the North Star that you touched on there, the long-term ambition for the tertiary landscape, purpose and impact. Secondly, the importance of system leadership. And again, Richard, you've just touched on that, leading beyond the boundaries of your own institution and actually your own sector. And then thirdly, the importance of that wider system in which we operate. Now, I would argue, and this is maybe up for discussion, but I would argue that actually setting out that strategic intent, that long-term vision, should actually be fairly straightforward. There's an awful lot of work and thinking has already been done to articulate that, including this report that's been published today. However, it's far harder to then create the right environment needed to achieve it. So in other words, too often strategies, intents, ambitions are developed with no parallel thinking and co-creation on what the system, the environment needs to be to ensure that those ambitions will actually be delivered. So the policy drivers, the funding, performance outcomes, leadership, etc. So you can have all, I would say you can have all the strategic intent in the world, but if the environment is characterised, for example, by silos, by short-termism, by a reactive approach, by a low appetite for risk, then the intent is unlikely to be delivered. So in terms of my own college and region, well, Edinburgh College is the only college in the Edinburgh region with 4 university partners, and I meet with my 4 university principals. We meet every 2 weeks, actually, to discuss a number of things, and already collaborate very closely around advanced articulation, supporting businesses through close to market innovation, joint delivery and teaching of programs and research, etc. So we already do a lot of that. But what we are doing more of now is going beyond that wider Edinburgh region to what is our City Deal region, which encompasses the 4 universities, but 4 colleges. So there are 8 of us institutions in total. Now, that's a strong foundation where we've got 4 colleges and universities that are already working far more cohesively to deliver, particularly around skills needed for the city region, focused on data innovation, health and social care, and construction. But our challenge is that enough? I mean, you know, should we just be continuing to do this? Should we do more of it, but do it better? And actually, we're challenging ourselves far more and saying a very basic question, which is this enough? Can we do more and do it better to have greater impact? Do we fundamentally need to take a step back and start from place, i.e. our region, and what our region needs now and into the future? And how best then do we collaborate to leverage the greatest impact? Now that is hard, and those discussions are quite sensitive because, you know, there are different dynamics across all of those individual institutions, but we are collectively committed to challenging ourselves as a group, but also challenging the wider system. So we're up for breaking the rules if it means helping to shape and change that wider system that is around us. And if I was to pick one policy recommendation that's coming out of a lot of these reports, for me would be to decentralise, actually. So in Scotland, there is definitely a very centralist approach to almost everything that we're doing within college and university sector. So it's about decentralising, so the importance of place and region, but giving real autonomy, decision making, trust, right at the region, at the local area where it's best needed. So Smita, I think that's my 5 minutes up. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Audrey. And I absolutely loved some of the themes that were coming out there. So the importance of, you know, the shared collaborative strategic intent as a starting point, but then the willingness to challenge and go much beyond that in the implementation. And lastly, crucially, that thing about decentralization and being trusted to deliver what you can, which I think is ultimately what's going to unlock quite a lot of this. Thanks very much, Audrey. Our next speaker is Shahid Mahmood, a person of many hats, but I'm going to ask you. So Shahid is the Chief Officer for Transformation and Change at Leeds City Council. He's also chair of the AOC and the Luminate Education Group, and lastly, Pro Vice Chancellor Designate at Durham University. So truly spans all the sectors we might want to talk about today. But I think, Shahid, you're going to share your perspectives as a local leader with hopefully some insights from your other roles, please.
Yeah, thanks, Amita. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to contribute to the event. I have been cast with all those hats on in my role as roving reporter from local government, so I'll try and meet that expectation. It's my last week as an officer in local government in what is a very politically restricted post, and given the context of national politics currently, if this event had been held next week, I would have added some interesting colour to this contribution, but this week I'm going to have to just rein that back a little bit. A massive thank you to colleagues as well that have been working really diligently on the report in the lead up to this event. I think the biggest tribute that we can pay to the report is if we continue the dialogue beyond today's event and bring to life in a very practical way the recommendations of the report. And talking about practicalities, as a local government officer who's spent the last 2 years deeply mired and contributing to the pandemic response, I'm very coloured by that very personal and collective experience. As you can imagine, I've got very little patience for complex arrangements that promise a great deal but then are quite underwhelming in their delivery. And if I share with you, and I'm sure none of this will be a surprise to you, within 24 hours of the 23rd of March lockdown 2020, the council had citizens knocking on its door with no money, no food, no medicines. It really sharpens your antennae as a local government officer and focuses you on what needs to be done and what needs to be changed to respond really effectively. And locally in Leeds, we pulled together over 7,000 volunteers across the city, when nationally we were still on that drawing board. And what that required was a whole system approach to developing an emergency response architecture, one that's still sustainable when the emergency is no longer with us. And it required really effective systems leadership to, quite simply, and I know there's a definition in the report, but for me, quite simply, it's very much about working across our internal and cross-organisational boundaries to intervene earlier, prevent problems escalating, and then resolve those problems in a very sustainable way. And that needs collaborative leadership, not just at that highest level, but all the way through the system, like a zipper. And what's important now as we recover from that pandemic is how the legacy of that experience is then hardwired into what we do into the future. And I'd like to reflect on how we might do that in the context of this particular report. So with that local government backdrop, and also my current FE and future HE hats on, in reflecting on the contents of this particular report, there's some general points I'd just throw into the mix that might impede progress on the opportunities presented in the report. One, first of all, higher education is still thought of by the public as what 18-year-olds do after A-levels, and still about leaving home and going away. And the question for me is that, you know, given some of the communities and neighbourhoods that I work in Leeds in my local government job, is that really sustainable? 10%, I believe, of higher education students study very successfully at further education colleges within their locality. Secondly, we still need real change in the system that supports young people and adults who, for whatever reason, don't do well first time round at 16. And that would deliver levelling up much more successfully, particularly if it's combined with excellent careers education, information, advice and guidance, which, whilst I understand there are efforts to bring that back in a more formidable way, still has some work to do in my view. Thirdly, we need proper investment in lifelong learning. We need more part-time and work-based study at level 4 and level 5. And we need a system that supports students to complete units or a full level 4 and level 5 qualification, and then move seamlessly from college to university. Fourthly, I think the response to the Augur report, the Levelling Up paper and the Skills for Jobs white paper need to shake hands much more and be better connected than they are currently. And is that a role for that FE-HE collaboration and in that space? And in terms of local improvement plans, local skills improvement plans, FE and HE have got an important role from a local government perspective to work with employers, local authorities, employer bodies, to really embed LSIPs in approaches to inclusive growth. In Leeds, the local authority in its civic leadership roles harnessed anchor institutions such as the universities and FE colleges in the development of a skills and talent plan for the city. Working in partnership is especially important for local authorities since academisation and the loss of staff with that educational experience over the past decade or so. And there's a layer of complexity added to that with new governance and accountability mechanisms like mayoral combined authorities. So in the interest of what I said earlier on about trying to keep it practical, I just maybe proffer 6 or 7 suggestions really. One is that for me, education is levelling up. So we must consider our roles as anchor institutions and work with other anchor institutions like the NHS in our local places to echo Audrey's comments to maximise that collective impact. Secondly, partnership working costs. It's not free, it costs in time and energy. So let's try and keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate. Maybe it's a very local government way of thinking, but let's not overcomplicate it. Let's build a coalition of the willing around specific themes that are important to our places, or because it's the right thing to do to get together, and then agree some themes that we need to work on. And in Leeds, the Leeds Learning Alliance of universities, colleges, local schools has coalesced around a philosophy of inclusion and is working with a common purpose to try and establish strong inclusive practice that supports young people to keep connected to learning and maximise their life chances for the future. Thirdly, let's look at our individual and collective impact from a community lens, not from that top-down approach, but from a community, and connect directly with those communities. It looks different to little Johnny, little Jane and mum and dad in some of our least advantaged communities. What would a community-friendly version of this report look like? Fourthly, let's consider the assets and resources in those communities and consider communities as partners in our collective endeavour to work better together across FE and HE and really help communities thrive. And then fifthly, I think the big leadership challenge of the 2020s is working with ambiguity. We've already got policies coming out from different ministerial departments that require handshaking together and better connection, and that requires interpretation in our local places. So the challenges outlined in this report aren't easy. And one of the biggest challenges for us at a community level is developing those coherent and enabled pathways to education, skills and employment. That's paramount. So how does FE and HE across that space work better together to enable that to happen with local authorities? Let's consider our collective approach to inclusive growth. Is it about building back better, or as Marmot says, is it about building back fairer? Is resilience just going back to where you were before the pandemic, or is it about being even better than that? And then finally, I think it's important to collaborate for the reasons outlined in the report. If it is, then it's within all of us to make that happen if we really want it to happen. And I think that's really key, really. We can't constantly keep thinking about the national policy contest, where actually much of what we're talking about we could already get on and do now and make even better. So that's me done. Back to you in the studio, Smita.
Thank you very much, Saeed. And I absolutely agree with you. I think we can fixate on levelling up as a sort of policy initiative, or we can say that we have ample evidence wherever we're based of the need for active levelling up around our communities, and we should just be getting on with whatever we can be getting on with. And I can see some really interesting questions in the chat about the sorts of challenges that institutions might come back to on that and say, how do we go about doing it? So thank you very much for that. Right, so our next speaker then is Mark Huddleston, who is currently director at, I'm sorry if I don't say this right, Mark, JHE Solutions Limited. Do correct me if I've got that wrong. And formerly a Northern Ireland Commissioner for Employment and Skills. And you're going to bring some perspective here around the challenges around actual skills delivery. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Smita. And thank you for having us here today. This is a really welcome and timely report, both from a business employer perspective, and also then I'll touch on the regional perspective for Northern Ireland and as one of the four nations, and how it can build here locally potentially as well. But from a business perspective, the vision and the shared vision that's outlined in the document strike a chord across all the different elements. The obvious one that stands out from business perspectives around productivity and inclusive growth and how that can support business and workforce development. But I'd go to the last vision, shared vision statement around how we can connect a coherent tertiary education skills system. And I think that's vital for all of our businesses, and Shay touched on it there in terms of inclusive growth and reaching into parts of our society and ensuring social inclusion. And that's vital. It's vital, as has been touched on, around people, place, and productivity. If we can deliver that in a dynamic and flexible manner, taking into account what we've just said around the ambiguity around the different legislation and policy levers that are being used across the UK at the moment, it can deliver beyond just a skills need and open up labour pools to business and the wider economy, and then have that knock-on positive impact into communities. But I think it can also do that because it'll start to link skills and innovation much more closely. And the opportunity from a business perspective to see our HE and FE institutions working so closely together on both a skills and innovation agenda that run side by side and parallel to each other can have a dynamic difference for the economy whether that's in terms of innovation adoption or deepening the opportunity that R&D and other activities can have through that linkage between, particularly at level 4 and level 5 skills for many businesses at the moment. Locally, from a Northern Ireland perspective, delighted that the report again highlights the case study around the curriculum hubs and what's been done there. But beyond that, there is a wider piece of work that the 6 colleges and the 3 universities here in Northern Ireland are working on around the tertiary education system and how it can become more closely linked and deliver more for, as it says, people, productivity in place. And it's really exciting to see that come together and see our leaders within those 2 sectors work and engage also with business. In particular, and we think about that whole piece as well, the fact that the Open University have become further embedded in the college and university network in Northern Ireland is really welcome, because that drives that inclusivity and the opportunity for diversity within that education landscape. And drawing those 2 things together, I've been fortunate over the last 4 years to be involved in a small program around innovation and skills that is taken lecturers and tutors within the FE sector and academics and researchers within the HE sector to work very closely together, particularly with micro and SME, small SME businesses here in Northern Ireland, to deliver potentially groundbreaking opportunities for those businesses to take their ideas and their products and the services they're looking to build and not only export them, but support them in their local community. And that's from a range of circular economy and green economy activities through to classic research and development. One interesting one was around removal of viruses from aircraft seats and how different materials can be used there, through to our health and social care sector and how to develop productivity and support the domiciliary care sector in Northern Ireland. So these connections and these collaborations can bring so much more at a very grassroots local level than can often be seen at a regional or national level. However, it's not all perfect. We have a lot to do. Audrey talked to that risk appetite, and we have a real issue around that locally here that we need to address. Slightly impacted by the shape of the colleges here being non-departmental government bodies rather than sitting entirely independent to the public sector as a whole. We tend to be very insular in our look in Northern Ireland, and that's why these reports each time they come along and recent OECD activity in Northern Ireland are really welcome. So they are, and we need to be more engaged across the other nations here, but also with our nearest neighbour in the Republic of Ireland. And we look, at 25 years of consistent policy and development of HE and FE collaboration there, and how that's working particularly under a single policy direction in the Republic of Ireland, which is really interesting. I suppose from an employer and a business perspective, 2 key recommendations stand out to me from a sector perspective, and it's been touched on already. I think it's a thread that's going to run through the conversation today, is unlocking the lifelong learning potential. Within the recently published skills strategy for Northern Ireland, it's one of the 3 key enablers and outcomes that we're looking to deliver here. And it's absolutely critical from a business perspective because it will enable business to grow, but it also will allow us to ensure diversity in the workplace, increased opportunity, and drive social inclusion and inclusive growth and productivity that is so particularly needed in the Northern Ireland economy, where we lag so heavily behind the rest of the UK. I think from a government perspective, I'm thinking maybe very specifically about Northern Ireland here, but I think it fits neatly across the UK as a whole, is that redress of unproductive competition through greater clarity and purpose. It's certainly a key driver for most business leaders and business owners at the moment, that you have a clear purpose that drives the vision and then that drives the strategy. If we can find a way of delivering that within the entire tertiary education system, I think the opportunity from this report and other activity at the moment from a tertiary education perspective can be significant. And hopefully that gives a bit of a flavour of where business is at the moment, Sweden, and what we're thinking here in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mark. And obviously it's great that there is so much consistency across all the presentations, but I think you picked up two things that we perhaps hadn't heard so much about. I think that issue around eliminating unproductive competition, which is implicit in what we've talked about, but I think we do need to explicitly address it. And some absolutely fantastic examples there of how you've taken, you know, small businesses and really made a difference to them, and the contribution that then makes to the sort of local economy and the skills that are needed and so on. So thank you ever so much. That was brilliant. And our final speaker is Jana Williams, who's the Chief Executive of Coleg Cambria, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the Welsh reforms that we've heard quite a lot about already, but hopefully give a bit more of a local flavour to how do you feel in Wales about them?
Thanks, Mita. So I previously, 2 years ago, was a principal chief exec in England. So I know some of the English challenges with HE and FE, and obviously moving to Wales, and now with the CETA bill, which is the Commission for Tertiary Education and Research, which sort of came out November 2021. And obviously we're just looking at some of the feedback that we're going to get from that. It applies to all our post-16 providers. So that includes FE, HE, but also apprenticeship, sixth forms as well. And it's looking at 9 strategic duties, but basically looking at post-16 and focusing on lifelong learning, collaboration, so that FE, HE collaboration along with maybe sixth form schools and apprenticeship providers. Equality of opportunity, which is obviously key in this and what a lot of people think have said. Our civic duty, along with clearly in Wales, for us to have a commitment to the Welsh language and also that Welsh culture as well. The focus is obviously going to be on post-16 and looking particularly at, you know, how we can develop those clear career routes. I think my experience of being here for the last 2 years is that Wales is incredibly collaborative anyway, particularly when it comes to funding, which is one of the key areas which I think is a challenge. And I think sometimes the funding that comes from Wales really makes us collaborate. So, you know, to get projects off the ground, you have to work collaboratively. And I'll explain in a minute something that we're doing with Bangor University. For me, though, everything's always been about the learner journey. So you can put funding and you put qualifications and all those other things in place. But ultimately, our role is to help learners navigate their journey to where they want to get to, which is ultimately the career of their choice, and help them as much as we can, regardless potentially of their, you know, their age or their background or the qualifications that they already have. And I think the importance with that FEHE is that we work together, recognising that we have different strengths and different weaknesses. But what we have to do as FE and HE providers is identify the common goal, which is to get those learners on their journey, to get them high level skills. And that's for everyone. And that includes working with employers as well, because there's many people out there who want to get those higher level skills that will really help their employers, but a traditional HE route isn't the way to go. And they might need additional support around that. I think in terms of the funding and what Wales can offer in terms of what it's looking at with its new bill will hopefully drive good behaviour. I think currently some of the funding drives poor behaviour. You know, I said in Wales we can have a conversation very much with key people about our funding, but I know my previous roles, it's just been about hitting targets. And actually by hitting targets, that can drive poor behaviour, which doesn't maybe meet the needs of learners or the needs of employers either. And I think the post-16 bill, hopefully, or tertiary bill, will help us develop that careers advice. Again, sometimes we're there to give qualifications, but actually we need to put people on the right qualifications to get the right careers at the end of that. And I think that bigger picture of conversation, which is about investing in new qualifications and support, so that, you know, in terms of the funding, in terms of the support, going from FE to HE isn't just about qualifications. It is about the wider support that students need, everything from developing their own personal time management skills, help to support them in terms of things like just like transport, simple things for some of our students. I think as FE, we kind of sit in that element where we're looking at level 4 and level 5 to help people back into education and then help them up to a degree level as well. We, for the last 18 months, have been working with key universities, one of them being Bangor, and we've seen how that development, working with Bangor in a really collaborative way, has meant that we're looking at a physical provision where we can both deliver to, but actually our learners and employers see it seamlessly. They can pop in, come out, start and take their way all the way up to degree and master's level if they want to, but actually work with employers to find out what are those qualifications will help invest back into the community, back into that levelling up, particularly in the north, but also encourage employers to base themselves in the northwest of England and the north of Wales as well, because we've got the skilled people at all levels and at all ages. Ultimately, though, for me, the experience of working collaboratively is when an entire management team, not just individuals, put that learner at the heart of a decision-making process. Our problem is the finance and the limitations of the finance and the funding at the moment often mean that we don't always look at the right things, the learner. But where we can, and where we can identify qualifications and emerging skills, particularly post-pandemic and post-Brexit, I think we'll start to see that growth of the numbers of learners come through with high skills. I mean, ultimately, I think we're here in Wales looking at those reforms and looking at how the reforms will help post-16 reduce the barriers of funding, increase the amount of skill routes which meet the needs of future employment and future employers, upskill people who have got some basic skills but want to develop them, reskill people because the jobs are in now are disappearing, there's new skills to come around. But ultimately, I think more important, empower people to have real aspirations to go on to higher level education as well, maybe from backgrounds where in the current HEFE environment, they don't see that as an option for them maybe. Thank you, Smita.
Thank you very much, Jana. And again, just picking out some of the things that you said that we probably hadn't heard before. And sometimes you reach a point where you think all I'm doing now is talking in the titles of former white papers. But your point about putting learners at the heart of the system is absolutely key, because we are otherwise chasing funding, targets, metrics in a way that's not helpful. And I loved this idea of it being seamless from the perspective of the learner. I mean, that would be a great test of how successful a partnership is. Can they actually see the hard wiring or not? And do they need to? Anyway, so that brings to an end the sort of opening remarks from the panel, which I think have been fantastic, and I'm really grateful to them all. We have got a lot of questions, which I think Natalie is going to help me with. But while perhaps she's coming forward with some, if I might just pick up on a couple of the themes that have come forward. I think the first question that really captured my imagination, which I'll ask the panel to briefly comment on, was from Scott Alexander, who made the point that given how tight finances are for a lot of universities and colleges, is it not inevitable that the focus will be on short-term survival or short, medium, long-term survival, rather than looking for opportunities to collaborate in the best interests of the learners and so on? And before I ask, perhaps I'll ask Audrey to start with that, and then Jana, and then the rest of the panel. I guess one of the challenges I would put back to leaders in the sector is that we don't get to choose the time in which we are leaders, but we have to show leadership whatever the time we're in and however painful it is. So with that in mind, Audrey, what would you say to someone who says, well, we can't afford to do this?
So I recognise that, because I guess instinctively almost, you know, when things get really, really tough and tight, instinctively you kind of hunker down, when actually what you need to do is the exact opposite, which is look up and out and loosen up a bit. So, you know, and that, as you said, Smita, that's a challenge of leadership actually, is despite the funding environment, there's even more reason then to actually create the space and the capacity to really, really think about the kind of medium to longer term gains that can be made. So, and I think for me, you know, otherwise you just end up in this kind of annual cycle of you know, just making do. And certainly one of the big asks in Scotland is to move from annual funding to multi-year funding, which does allow not just a more strategic approach to planning, but also allows for a period of transition towards. because I have this constant debate around we need to be ambitious and bold, and then somebody will say, yeah, and the but is always about, but we can't destabilise, you know, we can't destabilise an individual institution or a sector. So we need to keep it stable, but at the same time be bold and ambitious. So for me, the solution to that is try, if we can, I know it's hard, but get a longer term funding period so that all of the stakeholders can genuinely collectively say, there's the ambition, and then transition towards achieving that ambition. So, but it's a constant tension of every day.
And so in a very real sense, you're being asked to make an omelette without breaking any eggs along the way. And I think that is perhaps an unrealistic thing. Jana, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to you have to just look at that learner, that what is the right thing to do. You need to know what's happening and you need to do the right thing. You then need to work out how you can fund doing the right thing, actually. And that's the more difficult thing. Will you have to take risks? Yes, but you've got to, you know, be explicit about what those risks will be. Might you have to stop doing something? Yes, you might, because actually that's not what the learner needs anymore. They need something completely different. And it's about the short and the long-term strategy you have for your organisation. But if you put that learner at the heart of those decisions, you generally do come out right at the end. It might be hard work and it's not going to be easy, but it's about the planning, and it's about saying, actually, this is the right thing to do. This will generate more students wanting to get onto this course and stay and progress and all those other things that you want to do as well. And I think actually you bring more people on board with you because you can explain why you're doing it, instead of, I'm just doing it because of the money. We're doing it because it's the ambition of us getting, ultimately our job is to get our learners a great career in the end. And how do we do that? And sometimes you've just got to take the risk, although albeit a calculated risk. But funding does have to improve to allow us to invest in those risks more than they ever had before. I think they've got to trust us a bit more as professionals in education, that we are going to make the right decision.
Thank you, Jana. I'm going to pick one more question, and then Natalie, if you're ready to go with a couple, when I've asked this one, and this one I think is one for Richard and possibly Shahid with his HE hat on. And it comes from Rory Duncan of the UKRI, who says that changing governance structures won't help of itself. Academia can sometimes be very closed and encourage linear careers. And so the question he's asked is, can HEIs lead the way, become more porous, love that word, and encourage the flexible dynamic careers that the report suggests? So Richard, did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and thanks, Rory. It's a great question, and I think it's important. You know, it's not just about FE and HE, but I think within the HE sector we see, you know, there are quite linear careers. It's not a single sector. It's in many ways that, you know, there's a spectrum within that. Look, I think yes, there must be a prize to be had in understanding better the system and the landscape across HE and FE. I would say there are plenty of steps along the way. One of the things we've started to do, certainly in South Yorkshire, is just get to know each other better. You know, I think there's the steps between getting teams together, talking about the same issues, getting people spending time in each other's institutions. So, you know, less linear careers may be a prize at the end of the day, but I don't think it's kind of where we are now or that. And one of the things, just coming back to the previous question, that we can do is, I think sometimes by stepping back a bit and talking to each other, we realize that we can be very busy being unproductive. And actually by just talking together, we can see ways to free up resource and capacity that we might never have thought of.
Thank you, Richard. And Shahid, did you want to come in on that?
Oh, there. Thank you, Smith. I mean, just a couple of observations, because I'm going to be relatively new into HE in that respect, because I've got a week to go. But two observations, really. I love that terminology around being porous or porosity, really. I think there's real opportunity for the HE sector to work more closely with the voluntary community and faith sector. They've been absolutely, I mean, I go back to the example I gave in my contribution around the response to the pandemic. In reality, the council never actually does anything on its own. It might provide a civic leadership role, then there might be resources at play, but actually in terms of trust with particular communities, the voluntary community and faith sector has that in abundance. So it's really about sitting alongside as a valued partner, the third sector, and enabling them to do more for them, enabling communities to do more for themselves and for others. And I think that's a key driver for me and a key contributory opportunity for levelling up at that really lower spatial hierarchy around particular neighbours and communities. The point about linear careers is a fascinating one, because if I go back to the point I was making around systems leadership, and the report talks to systems leadership as well, I think the challenges with linear careers is that you end up with individuals in leadership positions who come through to that senior leadership role through functional excellence. And actually systems leadership doesn't look for functional excellence. It actually looks for you to be better at dealing with and liaising and building relationships with other functions, other parts of the organisation and outside your organisation. And that's where we've got a significant leadership challenge in terms of capability and capacity. So HE institutions could play a significant role in enabling and allowing that to flourish.
Thank you, Shane. Natalie, have you got some suggested questions? I have found one more, but I'm going to leave it till the end.
Great, thanks, Amita. And yes, I'm trying to capture all the questions that are coming through, but I think if we kind of capture them in sort of different categories, there's been quite a bit of interest, I think, around the sort of levelling up agenda, including a specific question about whether the SDGs might be a useful framing device for institutions to come together at a local level to think about some of these skills challenges. There's also been quite a bit of interest, I think, in the Q&A about this idea of a single funder, a single regulatory body, and how that might work across the different nations, and what are some of the tensions and trade-offs perhaps between the way the different nations do approach this and what some of the benefits might be of that single regulator approach. Really interesting question from Mike Ratcliffe at NTU, who have been doing a lot of work in this space around the sort of notion of a messy middle, and how that looks different in a city or town where you've only got one FE provider, for example, or one HE provider, compared to those other cities which might have multiple FE providers and multiple HE. So what are the sort of solutions to the messy middle when you have those different types of geographies? We had a great question from Kevin Richards around what we might learn from other places. So we've obviously in the report, as one of the authors, tried to look at the 4 nations, but in the US, for example, there are quite interesting approaches there between public universities and community colleges that we might be able to learn from. So a question there from Kevin. Seb Smoller puts in a question there, which I think has come to the heart of many of the panelists have referred to, about how much can really happen beyond these islands of the willing if you don't have the sort of structures and judgments aligned to really make sure that these things do happen between HE and FE. So the way institutions are judged are embedded in some of the ideas coming forward. And I think 2 final questions, Samita, which I think will be interested in the panelists' views. One from Jenny at the University of Sheffield around what role for voluntary and community groups in helping to deliver this agenda. Really important question there. And also David Green from Wales talking about how in the Welsh system, the sort of current legislation going through is very much around learners, and learners being at the heart of the civic mission, and contrasting that perhaps with some of the English language where it's very much sort of focused at a regulatory level on the student alone. So trying to capture quite a lot of questions coming through there, Smita.
Well, yes, and we've only got 15 minutes. I'm going to try and just pick out some of the ones. And in fact, as you went for the one that I was going to ask, I'm going to go to that one next, which is we talked about the fact that we need to have a policy environment that supports the right actions towards collaboration, etc. But I think David Green's question is right, which is that you've got an example in Wales, which is attempting to look at the whole institution activity and how it can support a range of missions. And in England, you've got much more of regulation around a very specific mission, which is the student interest. So it will be interesting to hear from the panel whether they think that either of those is the right approach. If one is better than the other, can you nonetheless pursue this collaborative agenda in a narrower where the regulator is focusing on narrower themes. I don't know if that question made any sense, but I'm going to look optimistically at the panel to see if anyone puts their hands up and says, yes, I'll have a crack at that one. Otherwise, I'm going to pick on you. So I'm going to go back to Richard on this one to start with, because you'll have got experience of the sort of regulatory system here. And then, unfortunately, Jana, I'm going to come back to you for the Welsh side of it.
Okay. Yeah, look, I think one of the themes that runs through the report, and I think it's both, you can argue it's both a tension but also an opportunity, is the balance between national and local, and how the kind of the policy environment is interpreted at a local level. It's no good having a beautiful policy environment at national level if at local level none of us get on. And equally, I think, just picking up Seb's point, if this is just about some islands of the willing around the UK, we are missing an opportunity. And if you live in an area that's not covered by one of those, there's a tension. So I think I'm less worried about the precise framing of the regulatory and the policy environment than I am about the ambition and the setting of an expectation on institutions to do better and to do things that work at a local level. I think how things play out at a local level will and should be different. And actually, I think having, if you like, an over-straitjacketed approach across any of the four nations, or indeed the UK as a whole, almost certainly takes us to the wrong place. So yeah, I see the risk and the tension, but actually I think there's a way to steer through it without getting too focused on the detail and sticking with the ambition.
Thank you, Richard. And Jana, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a new bill that's going through, and the focus on that will be, I suppose, how it shapes itself over the next coming years. And I think we need time to be able to shape it as well. I don't think even what it starts off looking like might change. I think it's got to go back to the fact that we're not, North Wales is very different to South Wales, which is very different to West Wales, for example. I don't think you can treat everyone the same in terms of how you access education, how you get to education as well. But it's also got to be in the results of the funding. So, I think sometimes we have at the moment the funding and the way that we deliver the funding, and some people are successful, some people aren't successful. But we've got to look at, is the funding driving some of those poor successes, and actually can we look at that completely differently? And as I said earlier, I think we've just got to make sure, if we're going to, particularly in Wales, put that learner first in that decision making, you can't then limit what you give a learner. So some learners need, I talked about, much more support outside the classroom just to get them through the classroom almost. But at the moment, that's not. Everybody gets the same amount of money, and sometimes that doesn't work. And I think particularly when we look at FE and H years as a good example, the one way we're going to get more people on low skills into higher skills is they need to get those skills while they're still in a job, while they've got care responsibilities. How do we help them travel to and from their place of study if they haven't got that money? How do we support them in a part-time job they've got on top of it? And actually funding can do that, but you've got to let the organisations use the funding in the way they want to. But at the moment, what we do is we make it all different pots, and we have to work out how you access those different pots.
Okay, and Shahid's got his hand up, so.
Just to come in on the back of Jana's contribution there, I mean, I think I've been in FE governance for over 20 years, and I've also been chair of a high school and a primary school as well. And when I look across, and I thought working in local government and understanding local government finance was quite difficult. But when you think about the funding that goes into FE colleges and the governance and accountability arrangements and reporting arrangements around that, I mean, anything that helps, and this is speaking to Seb's point around aligning governance and arrangements, is anything that can help us with things like that is really key, because FE colleges, like any institutions, want to be trusted to get on with the job, to use the vernacular that's been used at the time, to get on with that job of serving the interests of those learners and meeting their expectations and improving their life chances. Trust further education colleges to do that in the right way and to work across the system to be able to do that. And in terms of governance and accountability, I think perhaps the starting point should be, what is it that we actually need? What are the building blocks that will help drive the levelling up agenda? And then build the governance and accountability arrangements around that. Don't start off with governance and accountability and then straitjacket every bleeding organisation within that governance arrangement. That isn't going to meet the needs of the neighbourhoods and communities that we want to serve the best, really. Sorry, apologies for the swear.
That's quite all right. We all feel like that sometimes. Mark, I'm going to ask you, if I may, to address something which was raised in the questions, but I think has been highlighted by the contributions we've just heard, which is the report is recommending a single regulatory body in each of the 4 nations. But we've heard a lot about the fact that would only be a starting point, because actually you then need to be able to deliver flexibly at a local level within each administration. So do you have any thoughts about, first of all, how the sort of single regulator might have to operate in order to be able to make sure that local needs are still met?
It's an important question, and one that when the OECD came to Northern Ireland and did a review of our whole skills system here, highlighted as being a critical piece to address. So it's something that we're still grappling with here in Northern Ireland. A welcome first step is that we now have a Northern Ireland Skills Council, which is trying to draw the different threads together. How we do that when politically we're in a little bit of a hiatus again here in Northern Ireland, and our skills strategy was to be a Northern Ireland executive endorsed piece. It's now just a departmental piece. Which means that some of the elements that sat within Department of Communities, and we heard about the voluntary community sector and the importance of bringing those furthest from the place of work into the system, that leaves aspects like that and addressing skills imbalances at a negative piece in Northern Ireland. But taking a UK-wide perspective, it's absolutely vital. Being able to do that on a sub-regional level and address those very important place-based issues is going to be a critical element of that. And that, again, draws you back into how you ensure the college is essentially nearly, and the university is nearly like the umbrella holder for a wide range of people to come and stand underneath, so that it becomes a genuinely collective activity that draws in from right through from level 1 activity and trying to get people back into learning right through to the higher end outcomes that are driving major pieces of R&D and then hopefully flowing out across the wider economy. And I suppose that goes back then to the levelling up agenda, and while it's looking particularly from an English perspective at greater devolution, which focuses more on place. I suppose when we look at Northern Ireland, we have 4 city deals here at the moment, which are in some ways linked to the whole levelling up agenda. And if we're going to sustain those outcomes and deliver the greatest benefit, then having a governance structure to address skills and balances, to create that culture of lifelong learning, and then embed digital skills and other emerging needs for the economy, then having some sort of structure that a local guy that worked with quite a bit from the CITB talks about being like a scaffold round the building, and allows people to move up and down and round and get access from various points, but from the outside, and then bring them in. And I suppose that's what we're looking to do. We're trying to create some sort of infrastructure that doesn't inhibit some of the massive flexibilities and opportunities that the individual institutions create, but create a way of allowing the maximum number of people from the most diverse range. And it was touched on earlier in one of the answers around in-work learning and that ability to drive that. How, for instance, from a social partnership perspective, our colleges and universities can link more closely with our trade union movement to enable union learn activity to become more inclusive and broader and grow in capability is just one example of the many different facets that would come to that piece.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. And Audrey, I was just wondering, within Scotland, how is that tension between a national regulatory approach and the local needs met? Somebody in the questions had reminded me of the University of the Highlands and Islands and those sorts of initiatives. So is it working well in Scotland, matching national and local?
In part, yes. I mean, we talk a lot about cohesion in terms of what we do, but there needs to also be cohesion at that kind of policy level as well. And I think that's sometimes where there are tensions, or, you know, it feels like you're being pulled in different opposite directions when the kind of whole policy agenda isn't cohesive and joined up. And that has unintended consequences or consequences when it comes to the sector. I mean, certainly the Scottish Funding Council, part of their review, one of the recommendations was to have a single tertiary budget. Is also to revisit the whole performance framework of actually what is important, Mark, in terms of outcomes, what outcomes we want to see at regional levels. So there has been a lot of thinking gone into that in terms of recommending how we can, you know, take it to the next stage. And my scaffolding analogy is not a positive one, Mark, like yours. I remember the chief executive using this analogy, and I've pinched it numerous times. Is that this, Jana, you're kind of the siloed approach to funding, and each of those has scaffolding around it that you have to climb, you know, build up, take down, work around, swing from. And that's very tedious, when actually there's huge scope to streamline and simplify. Actually, if you keep a focus on outcomes, then all of this, you know, stuff that goes on could be simplified and streamlined so much, and put the responsibility and the power and the autonomy and the trust into the regions, but have a very clear national performance framework, very clear national policy direction.
Thank you. And then the last point I wanted to go to Shaid on was Mike Ratcliffe's interesting question about the messy middle, whether it always exists when there's such a difference in spread of provision across localities, cities, regions, etc.
Thanks, Amita. I think as a basic premise or a principle, I think we have to acknowledge that we've got, even within one country, we've got such a diversity of place. You know, in the FE sector, we've got city colleges, we've got rural colleges, we've got colleges based in coastal communities, and it's really difficult to have a one-size-fits-all policy right across that in terms of approach. I think it's important to recognise that and actually celebrate the fact that we are so different and therefore are mandated to respond in a very principled way at that local level, reflecting the local circumstances. There was a point I think made earlier on about where you've got places with more than one FE provider. And I think from what I'm sensing with some of the work we're doing across the Association of Colleges with our member organisations is that increasingly further education colleges are looking to collaborate across those multiple FE providers, particularly around particular places, and think differently about how they work as a collegiate group together, which then helps universities because you've got then that critical mass of FE providers speaking with one voice. I think the second element is around investment in local and regional partnerships, and there's a role for colleges to play around that. And particularly, the point I would make is there could be a school of thought that says, you know, when you've got loads of money, you probably feel better about collaborating because you've got loads of money. Well, actually, councils have found that they needed to collaborate much more in the last decade because they've got significantly less money. And my own council's got to find another £120 million out of a revenue budget of 500 or 600 million now. So it's getting smaller and smaller. So it's quite rightly, and because it wants to, it's because it's the right thing to do, is to collaborate with third sector, because a lot of resources now are going around councils and funding's going directly to voluntary community and faith organisations. So the collaboration is key. So I'd make those 2 points really. Think about how FE collaborates across a particular place where we've got multiple providers, and think about how as a system we invest locally in that local and regional partnership working.
Well, thank you very much, Shaid. And unfortunately, we've reached the end of the session. I'd just like to thank everybody who's joined us today in the audience. Thank you for some fantastic questions. I'd like to thank the panelists who've been just brilliant, some excellent insights there. Just to mention a couple of things. First of all, there's an upcoming event on the 22nd of March, which is the next Civic University Network event, which is about connecting climate to civic action. That sounds fascinating. the Civic University Network have asked me to let you know that you can join in their members area, and there will be a link in the chat to register with that. And finally, keep up with the progress on this work by subscribing to the newsletter. And again, the relevant links to do that are in the chat to subscribe. So once again, thank you very much and goodbye.